My name is Feyijimi, but you can call me FJ. I mean, that's quite easy for most people to pronounce. I'm a software engineer and I'm also a technical writer. I have over 7 years of experience in the software engineering field. And also I've had the opportunity to contribute to open source documentations and also to write. So I've been working at the intersection of both engineering, documentation, and systems. So a little bit about me. I spend a lot of time thinking about how teams could write docs, how, most importantly, how docs could be made simple. And that's the essence of this particular talk, which introduces us to docs that invite devs. So the main purpose of this particular discussion, I wouldn't call it a call, I'll call it discussion, is we just don't think about writing documentation, but we also think of designing documentation that would actually invite people to contribute. So without further ado, I'm going to run us through um, the agenda for today. So I'm going to talk about the problem with most documentation. Then I'm going to talk about the major conversation for today, which is what docs that invite devs really mean. And then I'm going to take it a little bit further by having a simple structure, because I created like a simple structure that anyone could apply and we could help them contribute successfully to any inner source documentation. And then finally, I'm going to also touch points on how to keep docs useful over time. So I believe at the end of this conversation, I mean, everyone will be able to see how they could identify why documentation fails to drive contribution. We're also going to talk about the right structures on how to make your documentations look navigable and also contribution friendly. And then finally, you're going to go away with how to apply a simple system to improve or build your documentation. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a pause here. Let's be honest for a second. So most of the documentations, I wouldn't say most, actually, I would say some of the documentation right now, they don't invite people in. That means they don't give people the opportunity to make contributions to it. And this is because some of the documentations might be outdated. Most people don't know where to start, which this is a major issue. Not knowing where to start in contribution can be a major hassle for most people. And as well, most people can't see a clear contribution path. I mean, I've been in these shoes countless of times where I want to contribute to a particular documentation, but most times I can't find the right place to start. I can't find how to contribute. And most times the documentations are really outdated. They are so hard to navigate. So most times when people face these problems, they just leave. Because technical writers, we always need to find a way to contribute clearly. Clarity and communication are our watchwords. And so not having a clear documentation part, not having a right contribution part, this would make technical writers leave. This is not because they don't want to contribute, but because the cost of them figuring out how to start is too high. So this is a major hassle for most of them. And most times they just leave. So I've personally opened projects where I just spent 5 minutes in the docs and I was really confused. I just had to close it. This was because the document did not motivate me to contribute. And this is the reality for most technical writers or most contributors out there these days. And to talk about the costs, this is where it gets really serious. Because when your documentation fails, this is no longer a writing problem. I mean, if it was a writing problem, it would have been much more easier to fix. But then when there is no clear paths, when your documentations are really hard to navigate, then this is a serious problem. With these issues, you get to see fewer people contributing, development slows down, your knowledge just stays locked with a few people, you're working in silos, and then to maintain maintenance, it becomes a bottleneck. And in an inner source environment, this is even worse because your contributors are not your team. They don't have context. I mean, they solely rely on your docs to get started. So if your documentations are having that difficulties, then you're going to face all of this. And this is very costly for your organization. So if your documentation does not work, then I don't think your inner source model would work actually, because you are pushing them away. You're not attracting them to contribute. So I mean, you see a lot of projects, you see a lot of documentations that are really fantastic, but then They don't have contributors. They don't have people contributing to it to make it top notch. So in most cases, the problem is not usually with the code. It is usually with the docs because of the reality of not keeping your documentation updated. You're working in silos. Your documentation is not easy to navigate and read through. This is going to cause a major issue for your InnerSource models. So let's talk about the shifts. Now, the mistake most teams make is this. They try to treat documentation as a content. Sometimes they just write it once and just update it really, or just update it whenever they feel like they should update it. But one thing I want you to have at the back of your mind is docs are not content. They are a system. It depends on how it controls how people onboard on your documentation. It controls how people move through your projects. It also controls if they are going to contribute. So in the long run, if you don't have a clear documentation, or your InnerSource model doesn't work, or you are treating your docs as just content, then I don't think people would want to actually contribute or actually want to take up your project for you. So these are some of the things where we should start thinking, where we should have a mentality shift about not seeing docs as a content anymore, but seeing them as a system. Because so instead of asking, are your docs properly written? The better question to ask is, do our docs make it easy for someone to contribute, or someone outside of the team to contribute? Once you have that question in your head, you're always thinking from the box of the contributors. Whenever you're writing your docs, you're going to think of them as a system. You won't think of them as just content, or you're just updating them occasionally. You're going to think of them as a content. So once you can be able to answer that question at the back of your mind, you'll be able to note that I need to start thinking of my docs as a system and not as a content. So now let's talk about the major question here. Let's talk about the major discussion here for today's call, and that is what inviting actually means. So basically, when we say docs that invite developers, this is what we mean in practice. A good documentation that is going to invite developers should answer these 5 questions quickly. The questions are, what is this? What is this thing? Where do I start? How does it work at a high level? If I want to help or contribute, where do I start from? And if I contribute, what happens next? So these are the 5 questions that any docs that wants to invite developers should answer really quick, because these are like the guardrails. These are like the watchwords you should have at the back of your mind about thinking about documentations that invite. What is this documentation for? So if your documentation cannot answer these 5 questions within 5 minutes, I mean, if you cannot answer the question within 5 minutes, then you've already lost potential contributors. So the whole thing is not clarity alone. You need speed of clarity. So that is why whenever you're writing documentations, or whenever you're building a product, or you're writing documentation for a product, at the back of your mind, you need to write 5 things. You need to note down 5 things. What is this actually for? Where would they start if they pick up this documentation? How does it work? Where's the high-level overview of the particular documentation? And how would they contribute? And if they contribute, what happens next? So by answering all these 5 questions, it's going to give you a documentation that invites contributors. This is going to be a good InnerSource model for you to think about that. Oh, okay, answering these 5 questions, it's positioning us as a good InnerSource model of contributors, where people can come contribute. They know where to start from. They know what to do next. They know what the documentation is for. So answering these 5 questions would give you the answers to if your documentation is actually going to invite developers. So now let's talk about the reality. And this is true for everyone, developers, anyone out there. Most people don't read. At first, when they get any documentation or it could be any content piece, most people will try to scan first. Developers will not read a documentation the way we think they will do. So when they come, what developers do, they just scan first. So when they scan first, they will skim through it and they search for keywords. So when they search for a keyword, they try something out. So if what they tried out didn't work, they would leave. So all of this happens within few minutes, because developers, I would say, they are not really patient. I would say that because once they come to a particular documentation, they want to get something fast. They want to get solution. They want to see, okay, if this is something they would actually want to do, this is something they would want to contribute to. So before they contribute or they do anything first, they will give it like a mini search. They would try out certain things. Is this something I want to do? Is this something I would want to try out? So if your documentation is designed like a long article or is designed like a wall of text with no clear hierarchy, then it's already working against developers that would want to contribute to your product or your projects. So your docs are not being read. Most of the times, your docs are not being read in the initial stage. They are just being scanned. They are just being skimmed, and they are just being tried out. So if developers don't get what they want from the few minutes from your documentation, they're going to leave and they're going to try out somebody else's projects. So this is one thing we should have at the back of our mind. This is the reality of how developers think, because I'm also a developer too as well. So I understand how developers think, and this is what they will do when they first encounter your documentation. So now, this is the drop-off point, and this is where we need to pay attention to. Before you start fixing anything, now you've understood what inviting docs means. You've understood how developers behave. Now, this is where you lose contributors. First, when there is no clear starting point. I think I mentioned this in the beginning, where I said your documentation should answer 5 questions. So this is where you lose contributors, where the developers would come and they land on a repository and they don't know what to do next. There is no clear starting point. You're going to lose developers that way. When your setup is painful, when there are missing steps, there are outdated commands, your developers are going to drop off. Your contributors are going to drop off. When contribution is unclear, they are also going to drop off. And finally, when the docs feels abandoned, because most of the documentation you will see last updated. So if your documentation has been updated probably in the past 1 year or 2 years, that's giving a sign of there is no recent update. And most people do not want to contribute to any documentation that's they are not recent contributions or they are not recent updates. So these are the signs and these are the drop-off points where developers and contributors are going to leave. So these are like warning signs for you. These are like things you should pay attention to. And now let's talk about the blueprints. So this is where we start fixing things. So now we've understood the problem. We've understood the reality. We've understood the cost of the problem. We've understood the drop-off points. So now let's talk about fixing. Now there is a blueprint. I mean, now that you've understood that your documentations are not inviting developers and they are not inviting contributors, so how best can you improve this? How do you fix this? So I've created like 4 blueprints that would help anyone create a structure or create a solution to fixing their documentation so that it could invite more contributors. So first off is the README. This is the entry point. And this is very important. So your entry point should be very clear enough. And where most people, when they come on your documentation, the first place they are going to go to, their entry point is always the README. And this is where you should actually take into consideration. You should put a lot of effort into this. Because now remember, developers don't read, they scan and they skim through. So they would go to your README. So once they go to your README, and if your README is not properly written, they would not have they wouldn't go through the next phases, they wouldn't go through the next solutions. So the README, it's the entry point for all contributors. And this particular point should be properly fixed and it should be properly paid much attention to. So the second blueprint, the second step, the second part is the getting started, which is the onboarding. So this is where they would understand, this is where they would get their understanding, this is where they will get onboarded to the project. Maybe this is where it will contain how to set up a project, what they need to have, the prerequisites they need to have, what they need to install. So this is a good way to invite them and tell them, okay, you've gone through the README, the getting started point is the onboarding phase where you get to understand how the project works. And then we move on to the architecture. So this is the part where they understand the systems. So they understand what each folder is doing, what each plugins is happening in your repository, what each file or what each code file is doing. So this is the part where you need to also consider, and this is where you need to also be clear on. And then finally, the contribution, the contributing.md. So this is the parts where they've understood your project, they've understood your documentation, they are willing to contribute, they've understood how to contribute. Then next thing is the contributing. This is where they take action. What happens next after they contribute? What do they do? What can they do next? So these are the 4 blueprints, which I believe it's a good structure for fixing the issues of docs that should invite developers. So now let's take a deep dive into each of these blueprints, each of these parts. So like I said, the README is your first impression, and this decides everything. In a few seconds, your README should answer what this project is, why it exists, how you can go through it quickly, and where you should go next. Like I said, the README is the entry point, so it needs to answer this question. It needs to answer this. It needs to be able to be. It needs to be clear on these 4 things: what it is, why it exists, how they can try it quickly, and where you should go next. So if your README is confusing, then nothing else would matter, because your README is your entry point, and your README needs to be clear. Because if your README is not clear, then they wouldn't go ahead to contribute, and you'll be losing contributors over there. So now let's take a good example of a sample of a bad README and a sample of a good README. So for example now, on the left-hand side, you would see how a sample of a bad README. Now, immediately, if you look at this README, you could see it's not clear enough. It's just showing the title of the project, the features, and their events. But on the right-hand side, you will see a good example of a good README. This has a clear description. It has how you could kickstart or how you could clone the project and run the dependencies. And it also tells you what you can do. It tells you the features of the documentation. So this is the difference between information and guidance. So a good README would reduce thinking, because on the first get-go, developers are just probably going to scan through it and they're going to come to your README. So your README should look like this on the right-hand side, that clearly states what the project is all about, how to get started, what you can do with the project, and where you should go next. So have it at the back of your mind that this is your entry point, and this needs to be fixed before contributors will want to make contributions to your project. Now, the getting started. So now taking a deeper dive into the getting started. The getting started is one of the most important sections. And why? Because the getting started should optimize for success. And this is because the getting started should show steps. It should show how to set up your project in minutes. The steps should be something that should be able to be, that you can easily copy and paste without having to go through different clicks or clicking through different things. Your getting started should be something that developers can easily copy and paste it. And the whole setup should work in minutes. They don't have to spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes having to run your project. This needs to be something that they need to do, set up in few minutes. And you should be able to the steps should be copy and paste. Because developers, sometimes they don't want to go through the hassle of having to read through so many documentation before they can set up your project. It needs to be able to be set up in minutes. It needs to be copy and paste. And then they should see exactly what's the result of their step-by-step guide should give them. So as they are finishing a step, they can see the expected output of that step. So this way they would know they are right on track and they are doing the right thing. So this is a good way for them to also error handling as well. So in case they run into some common errors, so you should have a section on your getting started for common errors or troubleshooting, like an FAQs, so that whenever they run into some errors, they can easily go back to the troubleshooting section and in the getting started and be able to solve their problems without having to leave your documentation. So when you put all these things in place, you put a good entry point, you put a good onboarding. A lot of developers would love to contribute to your project. So this is another key step. This is part of the blueprint, which I think everyone should start thinking about and should put it at the back of their mind that these are the ways to invite developers. And then let's talk about architecture. Now, once they are in, once somebody is through the door, you want to keep them in the room. You don't want them to step out of the door. Now they've gone through your entry points. That is good. They've gone through the onboarding. That's perfect. So now you want to keep them. You want to make them to keep contributing. How do you do that? You have a good architecture. Once somebody is in, they need a good context. Your architecture docs, you shouldn't overwhelm them. You should answer a few questions like, what are the main parts of the system? How do they connect? What should I know before touching anything? So once that is clear for them, I mean, you could as well put some of this information in the getting started as well. So they have like a broad overview. But then in the architecture section, you can now break it down into simple steps where you can answer the question of what are the main parts? How do they connect? What should they do before they touch anything? Because most developers, they wouldn't contribute because they don't know, not because they can't, but because they are not sure that they won't break anything. So if you put at the back of the mind that developers would not want to contribute, not because they don't have the skill set, or not because they are not smart enough to contribute, but because they don't want to. Imagine you have over 1,000 lines of code and with multiple folders. They don't want to break something. They don't want to tamper with some of your structures. So this is a good way to have a clear architecture that shows how the systems connect, how the systems talk to each other, the key component of the system. So they would know that, oh, okay, I can't contribute to this particular section. I think this other section would be a good place for me to contribute. So this is a good way for them to think about, oh, I don't want to break this, because you put at the back of your mind that developers are just contributors. They're not like a big part of your team. They're contributors. So they don't want to tamper with existing code files. They don't want to tamper with something that might break it. So, and how do you give them clarity? Is by having a good architecture that shows how systems are connected together. So this is a good way for you to show them that, okay, these are the things you can do. Don't worry, you can try this out. This is not going to affect any of your systems. I would make sure that whatever you do, it doesn't affect the larger scale. So this is a good way to reassure them that, okay, come, this documentation is a good thing for you. You are invited to contribute. So this gives them reassurance, having a proper architecture. So now let's talk about contributing. This is the final step of the blueprint. So now you've taken them through a good README, you've taken them through a good getting started that onboards them to the system, and you've kept them in the room through a proper architecture. So now, contributions. So this is where you convert your intent into action. Now, this is a very vital and important part of the blueprint, because your contributing guide should remove any uncertainty completely. So having at the back of your mind that your contributing guide should answer questions like, what kind of contributions are welcome? How do I actually make a contribution? What standards do I follow? And what happens after submission? And one thing that helps a lot, show an example. You could show a sample of how to make a good commit, how to make a good PR. Don't just show them, don't just describe them, demonstrate it to them. Because one thing about developers and one thing about your docs that you should have at the back of your mind is most developers, they want to contribute, but they don't have that opportunity. They don't have probably your documentation is not giving them the opportunity to be able to contribute properly, most likely because they didn't answer a few questions like what kind of contributions are welcome and what happens after they submit. So if people have to guess on how to contribute, they wouldn't waste their time to guess. So you need to be clear and you need to put an action plan and an action step that, okay, this is the right way to go. This is the right way to contribute. This is what you need to do, and this is how you can go about it. So let's talk about so now let's talk about the real problem. So we've talked about the reality. So now the real problem is over time, one thing you've done the blueprint, but have it at the back of your mind that that's not the finished part. You should have it at the back of your mind that you need to keep maintaining it. And this is where most teams will struggle. You need to keep maintaining your documentation. You make sure that whenever over time things will change in the code. So whenever there are changes, you need to go and update your documentation. So whenever some sections become inconsistent, you need to go and make some changes because now the contributors are through the door, they're already contributing, but they don't want to, you still want to invite more contributors. And this way, you need to make sure you maintain it properly. That is by keeping it outdated, by keeping it updated, sorry, by keeping it consistent and making sure that whenever there are changes to your docs, whenever there are changes to your code, you don't just forget your docs. You as well make changes to the docs as well. So once you have it at the back of your mind that you need to keep maintaining, I don't think you're going to have or run through major problems to keep more contributors coming into your existing model. This is a very good model since you've already understood the problem, you've understood how to tackle the problem, and then moving forward, you know the next thing you need to do is keep maintaining it so that more contributors can come into the door. More contributors can come into the door. Sorry. So now, so just to wrap up a little bit, you need to have a system. So one good thing about maintaining, one good thing about keeping your documentations inviting is you need to have a system behind the docs. You need to have a system behind the docs. You need to treat your docs like code. You need to use templates so that your structures can stay consistent. And as well, you need to think about automation too as well. Because you know we are in the age of automation right now. So you need to make sure that your documentation, when there are changes in your code, automatically it is automated to update your documentation too as well. And most importantly, you need to assign ownerships. Because if no one owns the docs, then it will always fall behind. So have these systems behind your docs, and I'm sure you're not going to not have your documentation that's not inviting. So make sure your docs are very hard to break. You have a system you're treating your docs like code, you're having a template so that your structures will stay consistent. You think of automation, and then finally you assign ownership so that when people or maintainers are owning your docs, they would not fall behind. They wouldn't fall behind. So these are some of the tools that could help you. You could make use of static site generators. So this is a part where most people will either overcomplicate or most people will just overlook them because they might feel, these are not good. I don't really need this. We don't really need this, but that's not completely true. You don't need to start heavily. You just need to have the right structure and you need to have the right tools. So for example, now you need to think of static site generators. So think of some tools like Docusaurus or MKDocs. These are good ways to help you organize your documentation properly. With Docusaurus and other static site generators, you get access to built-in navigations, you have a way for them to search through your documentation, and you have a clean structure. And this is a very good way for developers to keep contributing to your docs. And as well, think of Veil as a good way for LinkedIn too as well. This would enforce consistency in your writing because you need to make sure that whoever is contributing to your documentation, the writings are consistent. For example, now with Veil, you can easily catch passive voice, you can easily flag unclear phrases, and you can as well enforce naming conventions. So with the help of Veil, it's going to make sure that your documentations have the right structures. Because remember, you need a system that stays behind your docs. So using Veil for your LinkedIn is going to be really good, and it's a very good way to make sure that your structures will stay consistent. And as well, think of your CI checks. Think of your CI checks too as well. So this is where your engineering mindset will come into place. So if your code has places for them to test, for them to check, then as well, your docs should also have that feature too as well. Your docs should have that features too as well. So you need to also have a CI check in place. And finally, a contribution template. This is one of the easiest way to keep inviting developers to your docs. So for example, now, when someone opens a PR or an issue, you guide them with the help of a template. With the template, it's going to comprise of what did you change? Why does it matter? And did you update the docs? So this is a good way for you as well to also think of having the right templates in place for the developer so that you can easily track what was done. Was this really important? And did they really update the docs? So this is a good way. So you are reducing the mental load. You are reducing the mental load for contributors, and you're also improving the quality of what gets submitted. So having these tools in place, this is going to make sure that your documentations, they keep inviting people, you're using the right blueprints, you're as well making sure that you keep maintaining it over time. So these are some of the tools that could help you reduce the friction without having to go through a heavy stack or using heavy tools. These are some of the tools you can start adopting from today to make sure that your documentations are up to date, your documentations they follow the right contribution templates, and it invites docs. It invites developers. And a simple framework, just to wrap things up, if you forget everything else from this conversation or from this discussion, I want you to remember this. Your documentation should answer 4 questions. Help me understand what this is. You should help the developers navigate without being confusing. You should help the developers contribute without having to make guesses. And finally, it should be updated over time. So if any of these frameworks, if any of them is missing, then your docs are not inviting. They are just blocking contributors. So I'm going to leave you with this. So if contributing to your project feels harder than ignoring it, then your documentation has failed. I would say it again. So if contributing to your project, it feels harder than ignoring it, then your documentation has failed. Because in most cases, people don't reject your project. They just don't understand it. They just don't have clarity to engage with it. So this framework, having this at the back of your mind, is going to help you make and invite more developers to contribute to your project, to contribute to your documentation. So now, that was a run through of my discussion, and with that simple framework, with everything I've discussed, I think now I can open the floor for questions. I can open the call for feedbacks too as well.